What explains this persistent lack of inflation?
Well, I think that's the problem, Eric, is that's why we call it the global misinflation, because we don't seem to have a good explanation for it. You know, it's a pervasive problem, as you note. Everywhere in the world, emerging markets, developed markets, you look, inflation is low, falling, and persistently surprising not only the Bloomberg consensus to the downside, but central banks to the downside. And we've looked through what could potentially be causing this series of surprising misses. And if you look at traditional variables, output gaps, things like that, it explains about 50% of it. Non-traditional variables, look at demographics, technological change, things like that. They don't actually explain that much. Demographics seem to have some impact there, but you're still left with about a third of this is just a mystery, Eric.
Marvin, what central banks are doing, slashing interest rates to zero, encouraging bond yields into negative territory, which we've seen in Germany and France, for example, and quantitative easing are all predicated on this faith in Keynesian economics, the idea that the triangle model, right, demand pull inflation, cost push inflation, and built-in inflation would actually work. Does this suggest that there's a flaw in Keynesian economics?
Well, I don't think we're there yet. What we have is a situation where central banks have a mystery. They're not sure what's driving this. They've noted and noticed that there is this trend as well. And that's part of the caution that you hear coming from someone like Janet Yellen in terms of telling you that the path for rates is going to be very data dependent and is likely going to be very shallow. On the other side of the Atlantic, you hear central bankers there using all sorts of new unconventional measures and trying to reassure us that those are going to be in place for a long time and perhaps even extended if they don't start to see inflation, because they're missing this. But it's going to take us a while in this grand experiment where we've seen, 31 different central bank easings this year, QE from the ECB, which people never thought would happen, and negative nominal interest rates across much of Europe. At some point, we do have to start asking that question, Eric.
Well, what question?
The question is to what sort of effect do central banks have on inflation? Have they lost control? Now, remember that one of the things I said is potentially a driver here is demographics, which just means that they need to try a lot harder. So if you think about a lot of baby boomers in their peak savings years or peak earnings years trying to save for retirement, they're actually pretty invariant to what the central bank does to the interest rate in terms of their savings and consumption decisions. And
what you're saying is that the older people get, the less, I guess, susceptible or they are to,
yes.
to the effects of
central banks
bank
can have less impact on them than on younger people who tend to be borrowers. And as a result, maybe it's just that. Maybe central bank power still works just as we always thought. It's just less powerful right now because of the demographic situation. If that's the case, that just means they have to work a lot harder, which means in countries like Europe, you should expect more and more.
So in other words, Europe should look more
rates.
like Japan. Japan has the most serious demographic problem in the developed world, and Japan has doubled and tripled down on quantitative easing, and Mario Draghi should do the same thing.
Or more negative rates, Eric. That's another potential path there. And then on the other side of the Atlantic, while there's certainly much more caution because of this global misinflation, you do have that at least the output gap is largely closing there. You're starting to see signs that wages are starting to increase, and potentially will start to get inflation pressures there. But it just means that the Fed has to be very cautious about that path.
You have identified a few other factors, I guess, that potentially explain this lack of inflation. Deleveraging is one, technological progress, productivity, and other, globalization. Pick one and explain a bit more like you did with demographics.
Okay, so I think one of the ones that's most interesting is productivity. This is one that you hear a lot of people say, well, now I'm buying everything on Amazon or I'm using Uber. All of these things are bringing down prices. The thing is, those are one-off hits to prices, and they should show up in productivity. And what we find is that while productivity does definitely bring down inflation, it actually doesn't explain this global misinflation problem. In fact, it actually makes it worse because productivity growth was much faster and higher in the mid-2000s than it is today. And so actually you're getting less disinflationary pressure from technology today than you did then.
It's a big, perplexing problem. I wouldn't want to be Mario Draghi.